David's piety and his sin. Neither his great achievements in war nor his remarkable good fortune moved David from his pious ways, or in any other way changed his mode of life. Even after he became king, he sat at the feet of his teachers, Ira, the Jairite, and Mephibosheth. To the latter, he always submitted his decisions on religious matters, to make sure they were in accordance with the law. Whatever leisure time his royal duties afforded him, he spent in study and prayer. He contented himself with 60 breaths of sleep. At midnight, the strings of his harp, which were made from the gut of the ram sacrificed by Abraham on Mount Moriah, began to vibrate. The sound they emitted awakened David, and he would arise at once to devote himself to the study of the Torah. Besides study, the composition of the Psalms naturally claimed a goodly portion of his time. Pride filled his heart when he had completed the Psalter, and he exclaimed, "O Lord of the world, is there another creature in the universe who proclaims your praise as well as I do?" A frog came up to the king and said, "Be not so proud. I have composed more psalms than you, and besides, every psalm my mouth has uttered I have accompanied with 3,000 parables." And truly, if David indulged in conceit, it was only for a moment. As a rule, he was the exemplar of modesty. The coins which were stamped by him bore a shepherd's crook and pouch on one side, and the Tower of David on the reverse. In other respects, too, his bearing was humble, as though he were still a shepherd and not the king. His great piety invested his prayer with such efficacy that he could bring things down from heaven to earth. It is natural that so godly a king should have used the first respite granted in his wars to carry out his design to erect a house of worship. But in the very night in which David conceived the plan of building the temple, God said to the prophet Nathan, "Hurry to David. I know him to be a man who executes his ideas as soon as he thinks of them, and I do not want him to hire laborers for the temple work and then, disappointed, complain to me. I furthermore know him to be a man who obligates himself by vows to do good deeds, and I want to spare him from the embarrassment of having to apply to the Sanhedrin for absolution from his vow." When David heard Nathan's message for him, he began to tremble, and he said, "Ah, truly, God has found me unworthy to erect his sanctuary." But God replied with these words, "No, the blood shed by you I consider as sacrificial blood, but I do not care to have you build the temple, because then it would be eternal and indestructible." "But that would be excellent," said David. Whereon the reply came back, "I foresee that Israel will commit sins. I will wreak my wrath on the temple, but Israel will be saved from annihilation. However, your good intentions shall receive their due reward. The temple, though it be built by Solomon, shall be called yours." David's thinking and planning were wholly given to what is good and noble. He is one of the few pious men over whom the evil inclination had no power. By nature, he was not disposed to commit such evil doings as his relation to Bathsheba involved. God himself brought him to his crime that other sinners might go to David and learn how to repent. Nor, indeed, may David be charged with gross murder and adultery. There were extenuating circumstances. In those days it was customary for warriors to give their wives bills of divorce, which were to have validity only if the soldier did not return at the end of the campaign. Uriah, having fallen in battle, Bathsheba was a regularly divorced woman. As for the death of her husband, it cannot be laid entirely at David's door, for Uriah had incurred the death penalty by his refusal to take his ease in his own house, according to the king's bidding. Moreover, from the first, Bathsheba had been destined by God for David, but by way of punishment for having lightly promised Uriah the Hittite, an Israelite woman, to wife, in return for his aid in unfastening the armor of the fallen Goliath, the king had to undergo bitter trials before he won her. Furthermore, the Bathsheba episode was a punishment for David's excessive self-confidence. In a way, he had sort of begged God to lead him into temptation, that he might give proof of his constancy. It came about so. He once complained to God, O Lord of the world, why do people pray to the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, but why not the God of David?" The answer came, "Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were tried by me, but you have not yet been tested." David entreated, "Then examine me, O Lord, and test me." God said, "I shall test you, and I shall even grant you what I did not grant the patriarchs. I tell you beforehand that you will fall into temptation through a woman." Once Satan appeared to him in the shape of a bird, and David threw a dart at him. Instead of striking Satan, it glanced off and broke a wicker screen, which hid Bathsheba combing her hair. The sight of her aroused passion in the king. David realized his transgression, and for 22 years he was penitent. Daily he wept a whole hour and ate his bread with ashes. But he had to still undergo a heavier penance. For a half year he suffered with leprosy, and even the Sanhedrin, which usually was in close personal attendance on him, had to leave him. He lived not only in physical, but also in spiritual isolation, for the Shekinah departed from him during that time. Absalom's rebellion. Of all the punishments, however, inflicted on David, none was so severe as the rebellion of his own son. Absalom was of such gigantic proportion that a man who himself was extraordinary size, standing in the eye socket of his skull, sank in down to his nose. As for his marvelous hair, the account in the Bible does not convey a notion of its abundance. Absalom had taken the vow of a Nazirite. As his vow was for life, and because the growth of his hair was particularly heavy, the law permitted him to clip it slightly every week. Even this small quantity weighed 200 shekels. Absalom arranged for his audacious rebellion with great cunning. He secured a letter from his royal father empowering him to select 2 elders for his office in every town he visited. With this document he traveled through the whole of Palestine. In each town he went to the 2 most distinguished men and invited them to accompany him, at the same time showing them what his father had written, and assuring them that they had been chosen by him because he had a particular affection for them. So he succeeded in gathering the presidents of 200 courts about him. This having been accomplished, he arranged a large banquet, at which he seated one of his emissaries between every 2 of his guests, for the purpose of winning them over to his cause. The plan did not succeed wholly, for, though the elders of the town stood by Absalom, in their hearts they hoped for David's victory. The knowledge that a part of Absalom's following sided with him in secret, though he was pursued by his son, somewhat consoled David in his distress. He thought in these circumstances, if worse came to worse, Absalom would at least feel pity for him. At first, however, the despair of David knew no bounds. He was on the point of worshipping an idol, when his friend Hushai, the Archite, approached him, saying, "The people will wonder that such a king should serve idols." David replied, "Should a king such as I be killed by his own son? It is better for me to serve idols than that God should be held responsible for my misfortune, and his name thus be desecrated." Hushai reproached him. "Why did you marry a captive?" "There is no wrong in that," replied David. "It is permitted according to the law." Then Hushai, "But you disregarded the connection between the passage permitting it and the scripture that follows almost immediately after it, dealing with the disobedient and rebellious son, the natural issue of such a marriage." Hushai was not the only faithful friend David had. Some came to his rescue unexpectedly, as for instance Shobai, the son of Nahash, also the Ammonite king Hanun, the enemy of David at first and later his ally. Barzillai, another one of his friends in need, also surprised him by his loyalty, for on the whole his moral attitude was not the highest conceivable. Absalom's end was beset with terrors. When he was caught in the branches of the oak tree, he was about to sever his hair with a sword, but suddenly he saw hell yawning beneath him, and he preferred to hang in the tree to throwing himself into the abyss alive. Absalom's crime was, indeed, of a nature to deserve the supreme torture, for which reason he is one of the few Jews who have no portion in the world to come. His abode is in hell, where he is charged with the control of 10 heathen nations in the 2nd division. Whenever the avenging angels sit in judgment on the nations, they want to visit punishment on Absalom too, but each time a heavenly voice is heard to call out, "Do not chastise him, do not burn him. He is an Israelite, the son of my servant David." Then Absalom is set on a throne and is accorded the treatment due to a king. That the extreme penalties of hell were thus averted from him was on account of David's 8-fold repetition of his son's name in his lament over him. Besides, David's intercession had the effect of reattaching Absalom's severed head to his body. At his death, Absalom was childless, for all his children, his 3 sons and his daughter, died before him, as a punishment for his having set fire to a field of grain belonging to Joab. David's atonement. All these sufferings did not suffice to atone for David's sin. God once said to him, "How much longer shall this sin be hidden in your heart and remain unatoned? On your account the priestly city of Nob was destroyed. On your account Doeg the Edomite was cast out of the communion of the pious. And on your account Saul and his 3 sons were slain. What do you want now? That your house should perish, or that you yourself be delivered into the hands of your enemies?" David chose the latter doom. It happened one day while he was hunting. Satan, in the guise of a deer, enticed him further and further into the very territory of the Philistines, where he was recognized by Ishbai, the giant, the brother of Goliath. Wanting to avenge his brother, he seized David and threw him into a winepress, where the king would have suffered a torturous end, except that by a miracle the earth beneath him began to sink, and so saved him from instantaneous death. His plight, however, remained desperate. It required a second miracle to rescue him. In that hour, Abishai, the cousin of David, was preparing for the advent of the Sabbath, for the king's misfortune happened on Friday, as the Sabbath was about to come in. When Abishai poured out water to wash himself, he suddenly caught sight of drops of blood in it. Then he was startled by a dove that came to him plucking out her plumes, moaning and wailing. Abishai exclaimed, "The dove is the symbol of the people of Israel. David, the king of Israel, must be in distress." Not finding the king at home, he was confirmed in his fears, and decided to search for David on the swiftest animal at his command, the king's own saddle horse. But first he had to obtain the permission of the sages to mount the animal ridden by the king, for the law forbids a subject to avail himself of things set aside for the personal use of the king. Only the impending danger could justify the exemption. Scarcely had Abishai mounted the king's horse when he found himself in the land of the Philistines, for the earth had contracted miraculously. He met Orpah, the mother of the 4 giants. She was about to kill him, but he anticipated the blow and killed her. Ishbai, seeing that he now had 2 opponents, stuck his lance into the ground and threw David up in the air, in the expectation that when he fell he would be speared by the lance. At that moment Abishai appeared, and by pronouncing the name of God, he kept David suspended between heaven and earth. Abishai then questioned David how such an evil plight had overtaken him, and David told him of his conversation with God, and how he had himself chosen to fall into the hands of the enemy rather than to permit the ruin of his family. Abishai replied, "Reverse your prayer. Plead for yourself and not for your descendants. Let your children sell wax, but do not afflict yourself about their destiny." The 2 men joined their prayers and pleaded with God to avert David's threatening doom. Abishai then again uttered the name of God, and David dropped to the earth uninjured. Now both of them swiftly ran away, pursued by Ishbai. But when the giant heard of his mother's death, his strength left him, and he was slain by David and Abishai. Visitations. Among the sorrows of David are the visitations that came on Palestine during his reign, and he felt them all the more as he incurred them through his own fault. There was first the famine, which was so desolate that it is accounted among the 10 severest that ever happened. During the first year it prevailed, David had an investigation on discovering whether idolatry was practiced in the land and was keeping back the rain. His suspicion proved groundless. The second year he looked into the moral conditions of his realm, for lewdness can bring about the same punishment as idolatry. Again he was proved wrong. The third year he turned his attention to the administration of charity. Perhaps the people had incurred guilt in this respect, for abuses in this department were also visited with the punishment of famine. Again his search was fruitless, and he turned to God to inquire of him the cause of the public distress. God's reply was Saul not a king anointed with holy oil? Did he not abolish idolatry? Is he not the companion of Samuel in paradise? Yet, while you all dwell in the land of Israel, he is outside the land. David, accompanied by the scholars and nobles of his kingdom, at once went to Jabesh-Gilead, disinterred the remains of Saul and Jonathan, and in solemn procession bore them through the whole land of Israel, to the inheritance of the tribe of Benjamin. There they were buried. The tributes of affection paid by the people of Israel to its dead king aroused the compassion of God, and the famine came to an end. The sin against Saul was now absolved, but there still remained Saul's own guilt in his dealing with the Gibeonites, who charged him with having killed 7 of their number. David asked God why he had punished his people on account of converts. God's answer to him was, "If you do not bring near those that are far off, you will lose those that are near." To satisfy their vengeful feelings, the Gibeonites demanded the life of 7 members of Saul's family. David sought to mollify them with the idea that they would derive no benefit from the death of their victims, and offered them silver and gold instead. But though David negotiated with each of them individually, the Gibeonites were relentless. When he realized their hardness of heart, he cried out, "3 qualities God gave to Israel. They are compassionate, chaste, and gracious in the service of their fellow men. The first of these qualities the Gibeonites do not possess, and therefore they must be excluded from the communion with Israel." The 7 descendants of Saul to be surrendered to the Gibeonites were determined by letting all his posterity pass by the Ark of the Covenant. Those who were stopped in their tracks before it were the designated victims. Mephibosheth would have been one of the unfortunates had he not been permitted to pass by unchecked in an answer to the prayer of David, to whom he was held dear, not only as the son of his friend Jonathan, but also as the teacher who instructed him in the Torah. The cruel fate that befell the descendants of Saul had a wholesome effect. All the heathen who saw and heard of this exclaimed, "There is no God like the God of Israel. There is no nation like the nation of Israel. The wrong inflicted on wretched converts has been expiated by the sons of kings." So great was the enthusiasm among the heathen over this manifestation of Jewish sense of justice that 150,000 of them were converted. As for David, his wrong in connection with the famine was in his not having applied his private wealth to the people's suffering. When David returned victorious from the combat with Goliath, the women of Israel gave him their gold and silver ornaments. He put them aside for use in the building of the temple, and even during the 3 years' famine, this fund was not touched. God then said, "You refrained from rescuing human beings from death in order to save your money for the temple. Truly, the temple shall not be built by you, but by Solomon." David is still more blameworthy on account of the census which he took in defiance of the law of the Pentateuch. When he was charged by the king with the task of numbering the people, Joab used every effort to turn him away from his intention, but in vain. Incensed, David said, "Either you are the king and I am the general, or I am the king and you are the general." Joab had no choice but to obey. He selected the tribe of Gad as the first to be counted, because he thought the Gadites, independent and self-willed, would hinder the execution of the royal order, and David would be forced to give up the plan. The Gadites, however, disappointed Joab in this matter, so he went to the tribe of Dan, hoping that if God's punishment descended, it would strike the idolatrous Danites. Disliking his mission as he did, Joab spent 9 months in executing it, though he might have dispatched it in a much shorter time. Nor did he carry out the king's orders to the letter. He himself warned the people of the census. If he saw the father of a family of 5 sons, he would have him conceal a few of them. Following the example set by Moses, he omitted the Levites altogether, and likewise the tribe of Benjamin, because he entertained particularly grave apprehensions on behalf of this already decimated tribe. In the end, David was not informed of the actual number obtained. Joab made 2 lists, intending to give the king a partial list if he found that David had no suspicion of the ruse. The prophet Gad came to David and gave him the choice of famine, oppression by enemies, or the plague as the penalty for the heavy crime of popular census-taking, only in order to raise taxes and inscriptions. David was in the position of a sick man who is asked whether he wants to be buried next to his father or next to his mother. The king considered. If I choose the calamities of war, the people will say, he doesn't care, he has his warriors to guard him. If I choose famine, they will say, he doesn't care, he has his riches to protect him. So I will choose the plague, whose scourge strikes all alike. Although the plague raged but a very short time, it claimed a large number of victims. The most serious loss was the death of Abishai, whose piety and learning made him the counterpoint of a host of 75,000. David raised his eyes and saw the sins of Israel heaped up from earth to heaven. In the same moment, an angel descended and slew his 4 sons, and the prophet Gad and the elders who accompanied him. David's terror at this sight, which was but increased when the angel wiped his dripping sword on the king's garments, settled in his limbs, and from that day forward they never ceased to tremble. The death of David. David once asked God to tell him when he would die. His petition was not granted, for God has ordained that no man shall know his end beforehand. One thing, however, was revealed to David, that his death would occur at the age of 70 on a Sabbath day. David wanted permission to die on Friday, because God said he delighted more in one day passed by David in the study of the Torah than in 1,000 offerings by Solomon in the temple. Then David petitioned that life might be granted until Sunday. This too was refused, because God said it would be an infringement on the rights of Solomon, for one reign may not overlap by a hair's breadth the time of another. After that, David spent every Sabbath exclusively in the study of the Torah, in order to secure himself against the angel of death, who has no power to slay a man while he is occupied with the fulfillment of God's commandments. The angel of death had to resort to cunning to gain possession of David. One Sabbath day, which happened to be the Pentecost holiday, the king was absorbed in study when he heard a sound in the garden. He arose and descended the stairway leading from his palace to the garden to discover the cause of the noise. No sooner had he set foot on the steps than they tumbled in, and David was killed. The angel of death had caused the noise in order to utilize the moment when David would interrupt his study. The king's corpse could not be moved on the Sabbath, which was painful to those with him, as it was lying exposed to the rays of the sun. So Solomon summoned several eagles, and they stood guard over the body, shading it with their outstretched wings. David in paradise. The death of David did not mean the end of his glory and grandeur. It merely caused a change of scene. In the heavenly realm, as on earth, David ranks among the first. The crown on his head outshines all others, and whenever he moves out of paradise to present himself before God, suns, stars, angels, seraphim, and other holy beings run to meet him. In the heavenly courtroom, a throne of fire of gigantic dimensions is erected for him directly opposite to the throne of God. Seated on his throne, and surrounded by the kings of the house of David and other Israelite kings, he intones wondrously beautiful psalms. At the end, he always cites the verse, "The Lord reigns forever and ever," to which the angel Metatron and those with him reply, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts." This is the signal for the holy Hayot and heaven and earth to join in with the praise. Finally, the kings of the house of David sing the verse, and the Lord shall be king over all. In that day the Lord will be one, and his great name one. The great distinction to be accorded David is reserved for the judgment day, when God will prepare a great banquet in paradise for all his righteous. At David's petition, God himself will be present at the banquet and will sit on his throne, opposite to which David's throne will be placed. At the end of the banquet, God will pass the wine cup over which grace is said to Abraham, with the words, "Pronounce the blessings over the wine, you who are the father of the pious of the world." Abraham will reply, "I am not worthy to pronounce the blessing, for I am also the father of the Ishmaelites, who kindle God's wrath." God will then turn to Isaac. "Say the blessing, for you were bound on the altar as a sacrifice." "I am not worthy," he will reply, "for the children of my son Esau destroyed the temple." Then to Jacob, "You speak the blessing, you whose children were blameless." Jacob also will decline the honor on the ground that he was married to two sisters at the same time, which later was strictly prohibited by the Torah. God will then turn to Moses. "Say the blessing, for you received the law and fulfilled its precepts." And Moses will answer, "I am not worthy to do it, seeing I was not found worthy to enter the promised land." God will next offer the honor to Joshua, who both led Israel into the promised land and fulfilled the commandments of the law. He, too, will refuse to pronounce the blessing because he was not found worthy to bring forth a son. God finally will turn to David with the words, "Take the cup and say the blessing, you, the sweetest singer in Israel and Israel's king." And David will reply, "Yes, I will pronounce the blessing, for I am worthy of the honor." Then God will take the Torah and read various passages from it, and David will recite a psalm in which both the pious in paradise and the wicked in hell will join with a loud Amen. Then God will send his angels to lead the wicked from hell to paradise. The family of David. David had 6 wives, including Michal, the daughter of Saul, who is called by the pet name Eglah, Calfkin, in the list given in the Bible narrative. Michal was of entrancing beauty, and at the same time the model of a loving wife. Not only did she save David out of the hands of her father, but also, when Saul, as her father and her king, commanded her to marry another man, she acquiesced, but only in appearance. She entered into a mock marriage in order not to arouse the anger of Saul, who had annulled her union with David on grounds which he thought legal. Michal was as good as she was beautiful. She showed such extraordinary kindness to the orphan children of her sister Merab that the Bible speaks of the 5 sons of Michal, whom she bore to Adriel. Adriel, however, was her brother-in-law and not her husband, but she had raised his children, treating them as though they were her own. Michal was also a model of piety. Although the law exempted her as a woman from the duty, still she executed the commandment of using phylacteries. In spite of all these virtues, she was severely punished by God for her scorn of David, whom she reproached with lack of dignity when he had in mind only to do the honor of God. Long she remained childless, and at last she was blessed with a child. She lost her own life, however, in giving birth. But the most important of the wives of David was Abigail, in whom beauty, wisdom, and prophetical gifts were joined. With Sarah, Rahab, and Esther, she forms the quartet of the most beautiful women in history. She was so bewitching that passion was aroused in men by the mere thought of her. Her cleverness showed itself during her first meeting with David, when, though anxious about the life of her husband Nabal, she still, with the utmost tranquility, put a ritual question to him in his rage. He refused to answer it because, he said, it was a question to be investigated by day, not by night. Then Abigail interposed that the sentence of death likewise may be passed on a man only during the day. Even if David's judgment were right, the law required him to wait until daybreak to execute it on Nabal. David's objection, that a rebel like Nabal had no claim on due process of law, she overruled with the words, "Saul is still alive, and you are not yet acknowledged king by the world." Her charm would have made David her captive on this occasion if her moral strength had not kept him in check. By means of the expression, and this shall not be to you. She made him understand that the day had not yet arrived, but that it would come when a woman, Bathsheba, would play a disastrous part in his life. Thus she manifested her gift of prophecy. Not even Abigail was free from the feminine weakness of coquetry. The words, "Remember your handmaid," should never have been uttered by her. As a married woman, she should not have sought to direct the attention of a man to herself. In the women's paradise, she supervises the fifth of the 7 divisions into which it is divided, and her domain adjoins that of the wives of the patriarchs, Sarah, Rebekah, Rachel, and Leah. Among the sons of David, Adonijah, the son of Haggith, must be mentioned particularly, the pretender to the throne. The 50 men who he prepared to run before him had fitted themselves for the place of herald by cutting out their spleen and the flesh of the soles of their feet. That Adonijah was not designated for the royal dignity was made manifest by the fact that the crown of David did not fit him. This crown had the remarkable quality of always fitting the legitimate king of the house of David. Chileab was a son worthy of his mother Abigail. The meaning of his name is "like the father," which had been given to him because of his striking resemblance to David, a circumstance that silenced the talk against David's all-too-hasty marriage with the widow of Nabal. Intellectually, too, Chileab testified to David's paternity. In fact, he excelled his father in learning, as he did even the teacher of David, Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan. On account of his piety, he is one of the few who have entered paradise alive. Tamar cannot be called one of the children of David because she was born before her mother's conversion to Judaism. Consequently, her relation to Amnon is not quite of the grave nature it would have been had they been sister and brother in the strict sense of the terms. To the immediate household of David belonged 400 young squires, the sons of women taken in battle. They wore their hair in heathen fashion, and sitting in golden chariots, they formed the vanguard of the army, terrifying the enemy by their appearance. Next, David's tomb. End part 79 of 95, TheLegendsOfTheJews.com.